Welcome to Surviving Society and Red Pepper's podcast collaboration, Beyond the Strikes.
In these episodes, we speak to workers across the NHS, schools, railways and Royal Mail.
This series places industrial action into wider debates about public ownership, working conditions, the economy, neoliberalism and, of course, capitalism.
Are you interested in some further reading on social movements and left politics?
You should be if you're listening to Surviving Society.
Red Pepper is a quarterly magazine and website of politics and culture.
It is a space for debate on the left and a home for open-minded socialists. Red Pepper is reader-funded with a sliding scale subscription model, ensuring its content is available to all.
Find a link to Red Pepper magazine in the episode notes.
Welcome to Surviving Society. I'm really excited today to be in the studio with Lydia Hughes, who is a former head of organising at the IWGB Union and editor at Notes from Below and Red Pepper. Lydia is the author of Troublemaking: Why You Should Organise Your Workplace. So Lydia's also organised with foster care workers, delivery riders, cleaners and security guards. Lydia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, so happy to be here.
And secondly, we have John Hendy in the building, our first ever member of the House of Lords, I think, on Surviving Society. John is a member of the House of Lords and chair at the Institute of Employment Rights. John has a long history in the union movement and was heavily involved in developing the industrial relations legal strategy for and with the Corbyn project. John is also an English barrister and politician practicing in employment and industrial relations law. Hello, John.
Hello. Thanks for inviting me.
And last but not least, guest producer and my co-host for this season, Liam. Liam, thank you so much for sitting next to me and joining me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. The series in general is looking at the recent wave of industrial action we've seen in the UK, and today's episode is going to be an introduction. So how should we understand the kind of recent increase in union action we've seen? What legal frameworks are the unions operating in? How is that changing? And how do the unions relate to kind of the left more widely, the Labour Party, social movements? And that's why we have John and Lydia here who can speak to both ends of that.
I'm excited to have a trade union focused series on Surviving Society because I want to learn more about the structures of the unions. Like, I feel like I'm obviously very much invested, very much a critical friend, but also get a bit annoyed with the unions. Very annoyed, and I kind of don't even know how to articulate like where that annoyance comes from. So I'm very excited to be learning from you all today. It'd be really great. Just start with you, Lydia. How did you get into your organising?
I'd been an activist for many years.
Mm-hmm.
I'd done every single A to B march, was always there showing up, but fundamentally felt so powerless and really felt like every single march I went on, it just did not fundamentally tip the balance of power in a meaningful way at all. So when I connected with some cleaners at my university, and then I helped them organise their struggle. We had amazing picket lines, the most vibrant picket lines you've ever had, like Zumba classes, face painting. It was so much fun, and some of the most militant trade unionists I've ever met. And through that struggle, helping them and working with them, I just developed this analysis that this is what we need to do. This is where we need to build power to fundamentally win what we want, our demands. And they ended up winning, not just the parity of conditions with the in-house staff because they were outsourced, employed by a third company, but they ended up getting rid of outsourcing altogether, which was amazing. They're now directly employed by the university and have huge improvements in pay and conditions. And the militancy and the power that they held just fully convinced me that this is, to win any demand beyond just pay and conditions, this is where we need to put our focus.
Lydia, seeing your smile and the kind of hope and happiness just kind of emanates from you, and it's like, oh, I want to do this. This is amazing.
I feel so much hope and happiness.
Yeah, it really, your aura, it's so clear.
Yeah, I keep talking to Labour Party people who are like, guys, we just need to keep ticking over. It's all about defeat. And I'm like, what? come on, guys. There's so much to win, and we're in a really exciting moment. So I feel great.
Oh, I love that, Lydia. And John?
We mentioned technical words that are used in the labour movement. One of them is organise. Organise has got a specific meaning. It means recruiting people into a trade union and organising them to act collectively where they can exert more strength than they could individually.
Love that. Okay. We've set the tone for the episode. I'm loving this. Collectivity, solidarity, organising.
All those great things.
Yeah. John, what about yourself? Lords, barrister?
Oh, well, it really comes from my study of law. I realised the only thing I was interested in was what we call labour law, which is the law of the workplace. It's the place where capital and labour comes into confrontation in the law. And I thought to myself, well, if I can't do this for a living, I'm going to get out and do something else. But if I'm going to be a lawyer, this is the area that I want to practice in. So consequently, I've spent most of my life on trade union matters, industrial action, rule books, and all that sort of thing.
I'm just before we get into it, John, I'm really intrigued because as a lawyer, or when you're training, there's so many different routes that you can go into, some that are more lucrative than others. And I'm always interested in when people have taken a route which is much more kind of based on improving human conditions when it comes to this kind of profession. So was you never allured to like other routes into law? Like what was it about the labour law that you were interested in?
No, I've never really been interested in tax or companies or matrimony. I mean, when I started at the bar, I did a few sort of family matters and just emotionally draining. And no, I've just not been interested in anything else other than the area where workers can exert some influence over terms and conditions and so on. I mean, I have done other things. I've done railway crash inquiries and the Lacanau House fire inquiry and stuff like that, which have been very interesting.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's industrial relations that really intrigues me.
John, you've obviously been involved in the kind of legal framework around unions for a long time, and they obviously are still operating in that environment. So kind of the consensus set down by Thatcher, but I don't think a lot of people really understand the parameters of how the unions operate. And obviously we've seen with the Tory government at the moment, they've made a lot of reference to European standards when they're introducing the minimum strikes bill, which is obviously nonsense. But I was wondering if you could kind of give a brief overview of kind of like the main restrictions that the unions have on them, going back to maybe Thatcher and running through to today. That's obviously a big question, but I think it's important to understand, maybe looking at the recent wave of action, why we haven't seen so much historically. And part of that is the law, part of that is obviously the unions themselves, which we'll get into. But you're the man to ask, I guess. So,
well, this lecture normally takes about an hour and a half. But we start with the building of the pyramids, because there are hieroglyphs which show that the first recorded strike was 3,000 years ago. But if we go back to more recent times, or at least to the beginning of the 20th century, from the 3/4 of the last century, there was a stability about industrial relations law. There were hiccups between the general strike and the end of the Second World War, and again 1970 to 1974. But basically it was trade unions had the freedom to represent and defend their members in a very similar way to the rest of Europe. But what happened in 1979 when Mrs. Thatcher was elected was that, as in the United States with President Reagan, they introduced this philosophy of neoliberalism, which is really goes back to sort of 19th century capitalism, red in tooth and claw, very, very aggressive. And the view of trade unions was that trade unions are entirely permissible organisations as long as they're not doing anything that might confront capitalism. So if they're organising cheap mortgages or free or cheap holidays or insurance, that's all very well, or even education, that's fine. But once they are involved in collective bargaining, in other words, focusing a collective strength of workers in improving or at least defending their terms and conditions, then the neoliberals and Thatcher and so on regarded that as a distortion of the labour market, which should be left to be free competition between workers competing amongst each other to work on the lowest possible wages, terms and conditions. So that philosophy led the Tories to introduce 5 separate acts of Parliament which imposed many, many restrictions, each one building on the last, on the ability of trade unions to defend and improve the terms and conditions of their members. And the current state of affairs is that, well, Tony Blair described it as long ago as 1997 as the most restrictive laws on trade unions in the Western world. And he was absolutely right about that. We do have the most restrictive laws on trade unions. And that's why trade unions have been in a very weak position and have been unable to really defend the interests of the working class. And what we've got now, of course, is workers who are so desperate, seeing that the value of their real wages has diminished since 2008, and the cost of living has increased. As we all know, price of food up 19%, cost of living generally over 10% per annum. People are so desperate that they feel they've got no alternative but to take strike action, and the unions now have managed to overcome the thresholds and the notice requirements and all the other paraphernalia of organising a lawful strike.
Saw you speak at a rally recently, an Enough is Enough rally, where you said something to the effect of a strikes bill, which is currently going through Parliament, which will basically implement minimum levels of staffing on strike days, won't be defeated by kind of the House of Lords. It will be defeated by people in the streets and kind of rebuilding union power. And I guess this is maybe where you can come in as well, Lydia, about the law is obviously extremely important and the unions have to operate within that. But historically, when the union movement has made massive gains, they have worked to a certain extent outside of the parameters set by the state. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how we could rebuild that kind of mass movement and where you see the unions at the moment in relation to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to kind of put it in some context from an organiser's perspective as well, having one of these legally protected strikes involves, this hugely expensive balloting process. Each ballot you see in the news will have cost unions hundreds of thousands of pounds. Got to reach a 50% turnout, and then you need a yes vote as well. And then you have to tell the employers 2 weeks in advance you're actually going to strike, hence allowing employers to make huge adjustments in those 2 weeks. And from an IWGB perspective, in terms of organising with low wage and precarious workers, this hugely discriminates against young, precarious migrant workers. Anyone who regularly moves house is probably not going to receive their ballot. We sometimes had ballots of even 100 security guards, and we were lucky if 50% of ballots even arrived at people's doorsteps, let alone were returned. It is an incredibly significant moment that this strike action has taken place. It's really important to note that. But lots of this, I think, hinges on creating that power at what we would call in the union movement the rank and file, which is the lay member of a union. So it's the member who works in the depot or the office or whichever workplace you come from. And it's about rebuilding the power there to push the union leadership and also push the employer. It's a dual fight in that way. And I think the recent strikes have really come primarily from pressure from above, I would say, for union leaderships at this crisis of cost of living. I think union leadership's been forced into action, but in my analysis, not so much from members being organised and making it happen, but because the situation is so bad in terms of real-term pay cuts. So yeah, I'd bring it back to that. Organising at the base, the rank and file members, is so important.
You've obviously written quite a lot about this in your book. Shout out. You're welcome. And you cut your analysis, if I've got it correct, is that after the Corbyn movement was defeated, the left should turn its attention basically to the unions, in a nutshell. So I wonder what you make of the current kind of setup of the Labour Party. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on this as well, John, where they aren't very worker friendly. Obviously, Starmer banned shadow cabinet ministers from going on picket lines. They have said they will repeal a couple of the anti-union laws, but they're not going to do anywhere near as much of a fundamental shift as we need. So is your message one of simply that we should stop focusing on the kind of tweaks that the Labour Party are going to be doing and engage in much more in the unions and the struggle there?
I would say it comes back to the question of power again. It's the same analysis we had in the Corbyn moment and the Corbyn defeat, the analysis after that, which is to make Corbyn a success or to be able to, keep him in power, we needed a really strong base of organised workers, organised in the sense that John has described, using their power in workplaces to create pressure and leverage. And, whether we had Corbyn or not, which we now don't, we need that power and that pressure still. So our argument very much in the book is that as socialists, we need to be focusing on building power at the site where we come into most direct conflict with capitalism, which is in the workplace. And we're not just building power to kind of create small tweaks in terms of pay and conditions. We're building power because climate change, because we're fighting, for example, when the Black Lives Matter movement really kicked off again in 2020, we as trade unionists in the workplace should be using our power there to force the demands of the movement. So that's our argument, I think.
Yeah, I would only add to that the two roots of the political and the industrial are not mutually exclusive. So the trade unions obviously have got to organise in the workplaces and amongst the rank and file and on the subjects that Lydia identifies. But they also have got to keep the pressure on the politicians as well, both to resist the wave of authoritarian, retrogressive legislation that's going through at the present time, and also to keep pressure on the Labour Party to maintain its commitments to reverse the industrial relations law that we've suffered under for the last more than 40 years. And the Labour Party does have a programme called the New Deal for Working People, which was written essentially by a group of trade union representatives. I was one of the advisors to that group under the chairpersonship of Andy MacDonald MP. It was agreed by the Labour Party conference in 2021, re-endorsed in 2022. And it's still live as far as I'm aware, but it's absolutely crucial that the trade union movement keeps the pressure on, so there's no retreat from the principles that are set out in it, which would reverse the restrictive laws that we've got at the present time and give unions and workers more effective rights at work.
I'm not in any way playing devil's advocate here. I'm talking as someone that's trying to be representative of people that don't necessarily understand or follow the trade union movement, even though they definitely benefit from the work that you all do. So what do we do about the PR of trade union movements, particularly at a time when you've got both a media and a government that are so anti the union movement? Like the normalisation of having a go at people going on strike, basically, is more, I think it's the most widespread I've seen in my lifetime. I'm only 30, so it might be, John, that you could come in on this, like the kind of union bashing that we see now, both in the government but also in the media. Like, how are we to respond to this in a meaningful way?
Well, I think one of the things is that people need to be educated about what trade unions are. I heard an interview on the Today programme this morning with Pat Cullen, the General Secretary of the Royal College of Nursing trade union, and she was introduced as the boss of that union, the boss. And that's very subtly, that's the message that's put across to working people, that trade unions are somehow leader-led organisations that dictate to their members, whereas the trade unions and the trade union activities that Lydia's talking about is the absolute reverse of that. It's ordinary working people getting together to say, we've had enough of this, we've got to do something, get the union involved, get the official down here, and we'll tell the official what they're going to do about it. We want to go on strike because the management is simply not listening to us. It's that sort of thing. Once people understand that the power is actually in their hands, they haven't got to wait for the General Secretary to tell them what to do. And of course, the case of the Royal College of Nursing is a very good one, isn't it? Because the leadership of the Royal College of Nursing advised the members to accept the deal that was on offer from the government, and the members voted to say no, we don't want it. You've got to go back and ask for more. Oliver Twist. I mean,
that
great.
was amazing.
Yeah,
That was really good.
yeah,
I think there is a bit of a PR disaster in unions. I think we could say that.
yeah.
We probably don't do much to help ourselves either. I don't know. Why I'm putting me in this as well. But I think we really need to. We've had a terrible issue in the union movement for years of disregarding lots of less established workers who often tend to be women, migrants, who tend to be very marginalised in the economy as a whole as well. So I think it's about pushing for that politics from the bottom as well, getting involved, having those conversations one by one, convincing people and convincing them to join. I wish I could say there was some catch-all, there's this one simple trick and then everyone will change their minds about unions. But in reality, we just have to go workplace by workplace, convincing people, recruiting people. And the transformation that happens in people who've been through a wave of strikes and struggle is phenomenal.
I thank you both for those answers. I think they're really great answers, and I totally agree. Like political education for the masses, like it's such an important part of the work we do here. I guess one of the reasons why I find it frustrating that the PR for trade unions is so bad is that it means that we can't do that kind of inward work, like on the left or within trade unions, which would help us deal with some of the issues that you raised, Lydia. In particular, I'm thinking about like race and racism. Like, I think that the unions have a long history which is not necessarily the most positive when it comes to structures of race, class, ethnicity. And I think that we're constantly kind of on the back foot trying to promote actually like this is the union is for good. It doesn't allow us to do that work, that inward looking work. And that's what kind of concerns me, maybe more so than the PR really.
Yeah, I guess I would say on the previous point, there's a constructed ignorance around trade unions. If you think back to like the 70s or the 80s, the number of industrial correspondents that were working in the mainstream media would have been like 50 or 60. So people had a much wider understanding of unions, what they were doing, what they're up to. And now there's hardly any. There might be one bloke who works for the Associated Press and a couple in the left-wing kind of smaller outlets. So I think it is very hard for people to understand what the unions are and that they actually aren't a separate body. They are just a collection of workers. Because I think that distinction is often used. Yeah. You see it on the media. Look, the union as opposed to, it's just the workers.
Taking that a point further, I mean, it's not so much the union's PR failure, it's the failure of the media to say anything about unions at all. I mean, they are completely blacked out of the media, aren't they? And the government is exactly the same. If there's consultation about anything, they never ask the trade unions for their view. So it's difficult for ordinary people who are not involved to understand what trade union and trade unionists are actually doing. But there have been some notable successes, haven't they? I mean, people have given Mick Lynch, for example, of the RMT, a sort of rapturous welcome because apart from anything else, he always says, well, it's not me, it's the members, which is exactly the message that needs to be got across.
I'm glad you brought up the example of the RMT because just coming back to my point before, it is interesting to me, but also makes sense that the RMT seems to be the union that get the most kind of media, press attention. I don't know how that works in terms of an understanding of who's successful for their workers in the unions, like a union which is mainly based of sort of men. Old white men. Like it kind of does for me, like look from outwards looking in, it's like, okay, so this is the union which gets the most prominence. Like for people that are kind of can be a bit skeptic of the unions but have a broader politics of agreeing with this, it does there's that tension there which I think some people would like to see addressed a little bit more.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I guess there is a massive issue of optics as well, isn't there? Because if you look at who is in a trade union, you're more likely to be in it if you're a female worker, if you are a black worker. Yeah. But then when you look at the leadership of these unions, there's maybe one female of like the prominent main unions who is a woman, and no current black leaders.
No.
I think that is correct.
There's quite a lot of women general secretaries there now.
Yeah.
Which is a major change from 10 years ago, or 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So things are changing, but always too slowly.
I know. We seem to be behind the Tory party in
On
terms of
represent-
diversity.
Yeah.
But I mean, as Liam said, the group that has the highest percentage of unionised workers within it is black women. And after that, I think it's white women, men following way behind. But we don't see that reflected in the press and the media at all. So yeah, I've always been a big supporter of seeing Mick Lynch up there on the telly, but would love to see something that represents the real breadth of the union movement as well.
The unions don't select what the media choose to put out. The recent strikes this week of ASLEF and RMT got enormous prominence, but the university lecturers, UCU or your former union, the IWGP, never gets a look in. I mean, they're not never, but very rarely in comparison. Or Liam's union, the CWU, the most enormous industrial dispute in that union's history, I would think, over the last year. A fight almost to the death, and yet you don't see it, even in the Financial Times, let alone the sort of more average dailies. So the media have selected stuff out.
Things that affect them the most, getting the train to work, maybe.
Yeah, I think there's two separate issues. One is the media select, obviously, the issues they think the public cares about, which is the trains. And then two, it is the higher representation within the unions and the fact that the unions tend to have recognition in areas that are relatively well paid, which is a workforce which is white. And as you said, Lydia, the harder work of organising precarious workers, which is often heavily racialised, isn't necessarily done by the big unions, either because they can't be asked or because they don't think it can be done, or they kind of leave it to the more radical unions, which are heavily racialised.
Organising in cleaners, I spoke to organisers from the bigger unions, and they flat out said it's not possible. Like, you're not going to be able to organise the cleaning workforce because they're too divided along lines of nationality, they're too precarious, they're too low paid. And they fundamentally did not believe it was possible, which I think we showed was absolute bullshit. But I think it is a prevailing view amongst maybe an older established guard of the union movement.
But they've been saying that since the 1880s, and they said that dock workers could never be organised.
I know. I wish they'd changed the record.
The dock strike of 1889.
Yeah. Whenever someone tells you that a group of workers are not organisable, you just tell them to shut up.
Yeah.
I think that there's also a third point on what you just said, Liam, in that I think generally there's a culture in Britain of suffering, as in make everyone suffer for as long as possible. I don't necessarily think it's a conscious thing that we engage in with culturally, but I think that there is an idea that why would you strike? You need to just work hard, do what everyone else does. Why are you complaining? I think that that culture of suffering and wanting people to effectively not wanting people to strive for more. I think that cuts across, and I also think that cuts across class and ethnicity as well. I think there is a tendency for us to, as as a nation, small or large, you want to imagine that, but that we have this culture, of a race to the bottom. And I think that really, really comes out during industrial action. I'd like to say that I'm always on the right side of that, but I don't think I always am. It's hard, like engaging in the spirit of collectivity and the spirit of organising is such it's praxis, isn't it? And it's really, really difficult. The wins are incredible.
I think that's what makes this current wave of strike action so important, because it is so public, and there's like millions of days of strike action that are being lost at the moment, which represents hundreds of thousands of workers on strike. So a victory now could totally transform lots of people's views on what is actually possible. Like, I genuinely think that that viewpoint that we perhaps hold in this country comes from a total lack of belief that it can be different.
Yes.
And that we can actually make it different. And from my experience organising in unions, the moment people go through that process of fighting and winning, you can't go back. You fundamentally changes your view of what is possible and what can be fought for.
Yeah, I think that is an important point. I mean, the negative solidarity, I think, is what you're saying is very real. And if I go home for the weekend, the anti-strike rhetoric from my family is basically what you're saying. And I think that's what you see of the RMT strike, is that it's not financial anymore. The government even admitted it would have been cheaper for them to settle the dispute and just give them the pay rise. But it's become a symbolic, I think, moment of it is either the workers can win or you accept your lot and carry on. Which is kind of what you're saying, Lydia. So I think these have become extremely pivotal moments for the unions that they have to essentially win.
I think Chantal puts her finger on an important point, though. My dad always used to say there's no limit to the deference of the working class in Britain, and we live in a very hierarchical society. I mean, I don't want to go back to the coronation and so on, but it is a very hierarchical society. Absolutely. And I think the contrast with what's happening in France, where the resistance to increasing the pension age to a pension age that we've virtually got in this country is amazing. Millions of people who are not members of trade unions going out on strike and onto the streets of every city, town and village in France to protest against it. I mean, British people find it much harder to do those things because of the way that deference is the word has been inculcated into us, that we're really not entitled to any more than we're getting, and those that have succeeded have done it under their own steam, pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps and so on. But Lydia's absolutely right. Once people get organised and feel their own strength, that's a different thing altogether. That's why the media, of course, never covers the successes, like the Fire Brigades Union a couple of months ago. It was a really good settlement they got, well above what's being offered to other public sector workers, unified, well-organised threat of industrial action, and the government gave way. Not a word in the press about it, apart from the Morning Star.
Also, this does kind of bring us back to maybe Thatcher for a little bit, in that she came into government with a plan to break the union movement. This was a well-established, well-thought-out system to change the culture of the UK. The Ridley Plan, I think is what it was called, where she was like, we need to break a very symbolically powerful union, and it's going to be the miners. And when she first came into government, she gave public sector workers a massive pay rise because she accepted that's where the kind of political wins were. And then she slowly eroded that over time. So I think the solidarity or lack of solidarity that we see at the moment has a long history, and it needs to be rebuilt, which is what Lydia is saying, from the ground up. And, unions working together, which they don't often do, if at all. I mean, we recently saw the NEU, the National Education Union, receiving a huge fine from the TUC for organising support staff, which the other unions claimed were their territory, basically. These kind of actions, I think, are like the complete antithesis of what we need to be doing as a union movement. So there are issues, I think, within the unions that need resolving. And I don't know, John, you would probably be best placed to comment on kind of, from my experience, which is obviously quite limited, the lack of willingness to work together within the unions, to me, seems absolutely insane. Like some of the unions hate each other, or they will refuse. I've been in meetings where people will openly talk shit about, especially the more radical unions.
They hate us.
This is something that we've spoken about quite a few times on Surviving Society, about the left in general. The unchecked ego of our broad coalitions within the unions, within the left medium, whatever, I think is going to continue to cripple us. It's hard. It's hard to see, like what Liam was saying, like people just not getting on in that way, even though we broadly agree on most things. And I do really believe that this is to do with a lack of interrogation of ego, both interpersonally and structurally.
The need for a collective approach is so obvious now, isn't it? We need what used to be called a popular front. We need unions to get together, and unions to get together with all the other campaigns and groups on climate change, on the environment, on renting, accommodation, on everything else that's being fought for a better standard of life for people. We need to combine together to make a massive popular front. But it's easier said than done, isn't it? It really is easier said than done.
That's been clear for ages, the need for that, and we're not any closer, I don't think.
Well, there have been tentative steps, haven't they? You know, the Enough is Enough movement and Arise and the People's Assembly and so on. But we need another initiative, or an initiative that combines those and into which the unions have a role.
I think there's been really great initiatives in terms of building rank and file consciousness or power, like even just telling union members that it is really important that you build from the base and that you are critical of your leadership. There's a great conference happening this summer of those leaders in their workplaces getting together from different unions to share knowledge and experience. That's the Troublemakers at Work conference. If anyone's really interested in going, it's going to be in Manchester in July. In terms of the question on ego, I think we find this wherever we are, and it's the difficult thing about organising at work, which is very fundamentally different from organising in other lefty spaces, is that you don't choose who you organise with at all. You know, organising at work means organising with who you work for. You can't choose that. So it becomes incredibly challenging for us who've only organised in left-wing spaces to confront different viewpoints, get people on board, change their minds, which I find really important. But often you're organising with someone and you fundamentally don't disagree on loads of stuff. It's a huge challenge.
I think that's important, Lydia. I guess when I was talking about the ego, I'm probably more talking about the leadership.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that I think we should strive for, or think really critically about, is what makes us different from those that seek to cause division or that seek to accumulate capital without a redistribution of wealth. Like, what are the things that make us different from those people? And I would really like to think that it's community, love, solidarity, and all those things have to be understood and interrogated alongside of ego. The people that make capital, make money through the antithesis of those things don't need to interrogate those things. But what makes us different from those people is those things. Does that make sense? And I think that there is the left and the trade union movement in general, I think, have got a long history of not necessarily doing that work.
That is true, I think, and you recognise that in a lot of left wing spaces, especially the unions. I think the jobs for the boys is quite an often thrown around term where people will shuttle between unions or shuttle between the Labour Party and the unions and kind of keep the power constrained within a very small space. Which does reflect, I guess, the need for what Lydia is saying, in that often the members aren't active in their own unions. They'll get an email about a pay deal that's been negotiated about their involvement, and they'll accept it year on year on year. And then when the time comes for a massive struggle, be it the CW fight with Royal Mail or the nurses, they aren't organised enough to push back. And what you see with the RCN, the Royal College of Nurses, who were able to say no, is that was a years-long process. Is that the NHS Workers Say No campaign was set up years ago by those nurses and has been building kind of consciousness within the RCN outside of this dispute, so that when the dispute came along, they were ready to coalesce and gather around a no vote. I guess the issue now for them, and we'll get into this in the NHS episode, is that the other unions have said yes, which brings us back to the point of needing to work together and how there must be a better system of doing it than we have at the moment, and that the unions are dragged to the weakest link essentially, and that if one of those unions accept a significantly below inflation pay deal, then that is usually the case for everyone. Some of the content you've been putting out, Lydia, not you personally, but through Notes from Below, which is you can describe what Notes from Below is. But the most recent publication spoke a little bit about hot strike summer turning into shit deal spring, and what you think the kind of significance of that is, and what you see is moving beyond that, or like what's the Notes from Below? How does that play a role in that, bringing those workers together?
Yeah, so at Notes from Below, I'm one of the co-founders of a journal called Notes from Below, and what we fundamentally do is worker writing, so encouraging people in workplaces to write about their work, about how they're fighting back at work, to spread those ideas and spread their struggle to other sectors. And our recent issue we've done on in and against the union. So how we're operating, how workers in their workplaces are organising through their union to fight back against bad deals and low wages, and then also how they're fighting within the union to force the leadership to reject bad deals, to take them on more days of strike action. So I think a dynamic that's incredibly important to recognise in this episode to frame the next few episodes, for those who aren't that knowledgeable about unions, is the dynamic between the union leadership and the membership. Union leadership, often, as you mentioned, the big egos, are in a position of receiving a lot of pressure from above, from employers. They're sitting in the room with employers, they're negotiating with them, and then they're also receiving pressure from below, from members who want to fight for more, who have who want to go on strike. And this kind of foot in each camp for the union leadership often lends itself to union leaderships with more conservative attitudes. They have to keep the employer happy, but they have to keep the members happy. And they also want to ensure the continuation of the union in terms of they want to make sure the union keeps paying salaries, keeps ticking over. And as I said, this can lead to some kind of conservative leanings. So fundamentally, I think our job is then to build that pressure from below, to ensure that pressure continues the fight against this real-term pay cuts. And against this shit deal spring, as we've seen. And as you mentioned, the nurses example is a fantastic one of that. Pat Cullen, the General Secretary of the Nurses, literally on BBC News said, I actually really underestimated my members and how much they really want to fight for this. And this is because the members got together and said, no, we want more, go back and get us more, and we'll go on strike to make it happen.
Guy mentioned two other points. One is just going on from what Lydia just said, sort of natural conservatism of trade union leaders. I mean, that's often the way when people in the left get into power. They find they're constrained by all sorts of forces and influences that they hadn't necessarily foreseen, but are quite obvious to the outsider. But the trade unions have also, in this country anyway, have been affected by a sort of legacy of what's described as business unionism. That's the idea that trade unions are simply service organisations representing, providing representation services to their members. And it's a very easy course for officials to take. It's a different thing if you're trying to organise a strike or actually fight for better terms and conditions. And of course, simply carrying out the task of representing members in disciplinaries or grievances and so on takes an enormous amount of time and doesn't leave a lot of room for initiatives or responding to initiatives from members. And that's been a force really over the last 40 years or perhaps more, and it's a big thing in America where there've been massive upheavals in the trade unions very recently to throw off business unionism and come to something a bit more radical.
What I'd love to know would be what it would take for you to join a union, or to I'd love to know more about the view that people have of unions and what is preventing a younger kind of cohort of workers from joining.
So as an academic, my union is UCU, and I would say that, coming on to the points I mentioned earlier in the episode, one of the issues I think members like myself, black people, have is that some of the issues that people will go on strike over seem very much stratified by gender and class and are rarely by race. We have some of the largest inequities when it comes to ethnic minorities within university, amongst university staff, and it rarely gets the attention or organising that it should. I think it's within the 4 fights now, is that BAME, or Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic pay and representation. Sorry if I've got that wrong, but the reason why I'm kind of not giving it as much oomph as it should have is because it very much seems to be a kind of secondary and third issue. It seems like you can generate solidarity or vast organising within our particular cohort of staff when it affects the majority of people within that. So what I mean by that is, I think that because there are not as many of us, if racism doesn't affect your lived experience, then I think it's very hard for people to reconcile with that or organise with that. And yeah, it's appalling, the number of black women in particular, and how we're both treated and represented within university spaces. So I think when it comes down to it, it's often that feeling of unacknowledgement, whilst also we're doing a lot of the heavy lifting, which has often been the case when it comes to the workplace, families, etc. So yeah, I think that I'm all for the union. It's all we have, as I say, it's all we have. I get it, but again, that lack of reflection, I think, amongst some of my peers and colleagues in a meaningful way, that never stops being disappointing.
I guess the recurring theme throughout a lot of it is that those fights are harder that, and that the unions tend to, through maybe no fault of their own, through legal frameworks, choose the path of least resistance. So it's okay, we'll get a pay rise for this set of workers at the expense of a minority.
I think it's harder because it's not necessarily hard. I think people make choices, and I think it's always interesting is the choices that people make with regards to what is prioritised and what isn't. And
it's cowardice. Definitely, I think one issue we have when you're trying to get everyone, a whole sector on strike, often people are like, let's choose the issues that everyone cares about.
Yes, that's what I'm talking, But
I think they fundamentally misunderstand that, the race pay gap, which is one of the 4 fights everyone does.
Sorry, 4 fights. Thank you for...
No, but you can often, even though it is the 4 fights, some of them conveniently get forgotten in union communications, and others get foregrounded. But I think that is the cowardice and shows the weakness of the union movement. That if we were stronger and that if we were really building at the base, then these incredibly fundamental issues could be pushed up the agenda more and more. But yeah, you're totally right. I can see that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that weakness is what leads us to focus on quick fixes.
Yeah.
Which often takes the form of looking to the Labour Party or looking to a policy solution and be like, these guys will come in and they'll save us. And then maybe they will, they probably won't, but they could, but they'll be gone in 5 years. And then that policy solution will change, which is what you see internationally with a lot of unions who have waited for progressives to come in. They might change the law, but that law will change back again if there's no power behind it, which I think is the danger at the moment, especially as we're running up to the next election, is that a lot of union circles are, banking on Starmer to do some good stuff. And he might, but he's not going to be there forever. And if the unions aren't organised themselves, then ultimately we'll be back to square one, I think.
I think you're right. That short-termism, I think we're failing to learn the lessons of the past, and that without having a cultural change structurally, interpersonally, about how we see people and how we do actually stratify who has access to like basic dignities. If we're not doing that inward work, I fear that all the things we're talking about now will continue.
That's the nature of capitalism, isn't it? We need a more fundamental resolution to that problem.
We do.
Absolutely.
John, can you give us just before we finish? Can you give us some? I don't know if you're allowed to share these, but can you share any kind of positive cases that you've like won with regards to employment law, or like things that would give listeners some hope?
Yeah, of course. I mean, you know, we've won cases in the European Court of Human Rights that have amplified the rights of trade unions and so on. But you know, I'm always very conscious that if you win a trade union case, you know, it's always on a very limited front. It's always a very minor in the great scheme of things. And you know, what we're really talking about is what Lydia mentioned at the beginning. It's power. It's power at the workplace. And, you know, lawyers don't change those things. No, court cases don't change those things. Court cases may make it worse if employers can get injunctions or massive awards of damages against unions. But I don't think legal cases are really the answer. I mean, they're very interesting for the lawyers involved, but on the other hand, I don't want to denigrate the role of the law altogether, because it's absolutely crucial that we fight again for the legal space for trade unions to have the legal capacity in order to fight for and defend their members, and we haven't got it at the present time. I mean, Chantal was talking earlier about divisions between workers and so on. Shouldn't forget the legal structural problems that exacerbate that, make it worse. The fact that unions can only organise industrial action in a dispute between workers and their own employer, so that all forms of industrial action in support of a dispute with another employer are absolutely outlawed. I mean, this makes for atomisation. This makes it impossible for workers to support each other. So one of the things that I've been arguing for really for decades, me and my colleague Keith Ewing, is we must restore sectoral collective bargaining, which is really a term of art, of course.
Oh, Carl, you've got to break this down for us, John.
Yeah. So this is the ability of unions to represent all the workforce within a particular industrial sector, whether that's delivery riders or parcel delivery or whatever. No matter who the employer is, minimum terms and conditions negotiated by unions on behalf of all the workers in that sector, which would mean, of course, that those workers should have the power to take industrial action on a sector-wide basis. And this is one of the things that we've lost. If I just take a moment to go back over history, if you go back to the 1970s, I know it's nearly 50 years ago, and none of you guys remember it, but I do. If you go back to the 1970s, in 1976, 86% of workers in this country had their one or more of their terms and conditions of employment negotiated by a trade union, a collective agreement. 86%, more than 8 out of every 10 workers. That percentage now is around 23%, which means that 3/4 of the workers in this country don't have the benefit of a collective agreement, don't have a trade union to represent them, and their terms and conditions are at the diktat of the employer. It's take it or leave it. If you don't want the job on those terms and conditions, go elsewhere. That is really what has so depressed the wages, terms and conditions in this country. That's why we've got so many people in precarious employment and 14 million people living below the poverty line, of 5 million of which are children. That's the basic reason. It's been the collapse of collective bargaining. And of course, as collective bargaining has diminished, so has trade union membership. We've now got half the number of trade union members that we had in the 1970s, which makes this current wave of industrial action all the more important, all the more significant for what it is.
Boom. I really enjoyed the John monologue.
Oh, sorry.
No, big history lesson. That was incredible. I can't believe that. We need to know the history. Yeah. God, we need sectoral collective bargaining. That's what we need.
I want to end on a positive note. I feel like we've been quite negative today.
No. But not in a bad way.
In like a really good
political
way.
Education.
Interrogate the union movement and some of it that comes out is quite negative. But I think we can take those negatives and really like make a positive and learn from the history and the current moment and get involved and fight for so much more. So I think I'm really interested to hear the other episodes of the podcast because I think, as I said earlier, this is going to be a really important fight, and I do feel more confident that we can win it and come away with a union movement that is ready to fight for the future. Because if we don't,
who will?
Who will? Who
exactly?
Will? Who bloody will? And God knows what will happen.
Lydia, John, Liam, thank you so much. That was brilliant. We'll be back again next week.
Thank you for listening to Surviving Society.
To support our work, you can rate,
review and subscribe to host or produce a series of Surviving Society.
Get in touch with us via Twitter or Instagram.